Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Scrolls. Tonight, we're going to wander through time, softly, slowly, unraveling the quiet stories of those who became mothers while still children themselves. No judgment, no harshness, just history whispered gently through the corridors of forgotten hearts. So, take a moment. Lower the lights. Maybe pull the covers up to your chin. Let your body melt into comfort. Let your breathing slow in and out like the tide against an ancient shore. This is your time to rest and drift. As we travel across empires and eras, I invite you to listen not for drama, but for humanity, for tenderness, for quiet courage. And if you find yourself still awake, perhaps you'll consider tapping that like button or gently pressing subscribe so I may keep telling you stories night after night. There's always more to dream about. Now, let's begin. Let's walk softly into the past and discover what being a teen mother once looked like in all the corners of history. In the villages of ancient Mesopotamia, long before the empires of marble rose from the banks of the Tiber, before philosophers pondered virtue in the sunlit courtyards of Athens, before great sails caught the desert wind to cross the Nile, there were the soft, sun-baked villages of ancient Mesopotamia. This land, nestled between the Tigris and the Euphrates, often called the cradle of civilization, cradled not only the earliest cities and laws, but also the earliest stories of girlhood turned into motherhood. And it is here that we begin our journey, in the still amber dawns of a world built of mud brick and barley. A young girl in Sumer, perhaps no more than 12 or 13 summers old, might wake to the sound of clay ovens being lit and goats bleating their hunger. Her name may have been lost to time. Perhaps it was Anatum, or Lilitu, or Ishtar, borrowed from the goddess whose name carried power. Her world was small, yet humming with ancient rhythms, grinding stones, pottery wheels, flax being spun into linen. Her eyes, still bright with the dreams of childhood, would soon look out upon a life far older than she. In Mesopotamian society, the concept of childhood was brief, sometimes nearly invisible. Girls were often considered ready for marriage as soon as their bodies began to change. Menstruation was a signal not of confusion or concealment, as it might later become in Victorian times, but rather a marker that the girl had crossed a threshold. This moment, often met with both celebration and resignation, was the beginning of a new kind of expectation. The family, eager to forge alliances or maintain economic stability, would seek a husband for her, a man perhaps twice her age, sometimes more. Marriage was rarely about affection. It was a contract, a transaction of goods and security, often arranged between families without much input from the young bride. Still, in the silence of the wedding night, beneath the flickering oil lamps and the thick scent of crushed myrrh, a child would be asked to become a woman, and soon after, a mother. The Hammurabi Code, carved in stone many centuries later, but echoing practices long in place, speaks often of marriage and reproduction. It speaks of dowries and inheritance, of fidelity and punishment. It speaks of miscarriage as a property loss, and children as legal currency. But it says little of love, and nothing at all of the trembling hands of a girl clutching her belly, unsure if the life inside her will thrive, or if she will survive its arrival. Pregnancy, for a teen mother in ancient Mesopotamia, was a time of careful watching. Older women, her mother-in-law, midwives, would observe her swelling form, offering herbal teas brewed from dates and anise, rubbing her back with oils made from sesame or frankincense. Superstition and medicine were deeply entangled. Amulets were hung above the bed. Incantations were whispered. Offerings to the fertility goddess Ninhursag or to Gula, the goddess of healing, were made in hushed tones at home altars. The world of the womb was divine, dangerous, and filled with mystery. The pain of childbirth could come suddenly, without warning. In a one-room house shared with in-laws and siblings, the young girl would be led to a mat, perhaps in the corner, surrounded by the reassuring hands of experienced women. No doctors, no sterile instruments, no anesthesia, only the rhythm of breath, the pressure of hands, the sacred chants meant to keep the mother safe. And as the child crowned, as the cries filled the air, the world outside would go on, goats bleating, carts creaking, barley being ground. Life continued as it always had. If the baby lived, and not all did, the girl was expected to nurse, to care, to feed and cradle. There was no pause granted to childhood lost. Dolls gave way to swaddles. Games faded into lullabies. And yet, there may have been love, a quiet, instinctive bond. She might have held that baby against her chest, humming the same songs her own mother once whispered to her. In those moments, she was not a contract, not a transaction, not a mistake. She was simply a mother, young but present, tired but still alive. What did she dream of in those early hours of dawn before the sun warmed the reeds outside her window? Did she think of escape, of a different life? Or did she already feel the weight of permanence settling over her, the understanding that this now was her purpose? Community helped where it could. Children were often raised collectively, aunts, sisters, neighbors, sharing the burdens of care. It was not unusual to see girls, still barely old enough to braid their own hair, helping others soothe crying infants or grind flour. Childhood blurred into motherhood, and motherhood blurred into duty. But within that duty, there were flickers of joy, a cooing baby, a moment of peace beside the hearth, a whispered story about the gods passed down while nursing beneath the stars. There were, of course, sorrows. Infant mortality was high. Complications during childbirth could be fatal, and for the youngest mothers, the risks were greater still. A girl might bear a child one season and be buried the next, her name scratched into a shard of clay, or perhaps not recorded at all, and yet the cycle continued. Another girl, another bride, another mother in the making. In temples, priestesses recorded the movements of the stars, the cycles of Venus, the omens of the liver, but they also recorded prayers for safe delivery, for milk that flowed, for babies that thrived. These prayers, etched into the same clay that held epics and treaties, remind us that even in the most bureaucratic of ancient societies, the cries of young mothers were not entirely lost. As we rest here, beside the cradle of civilization, it is tempting to romanticize it, to imagine a simpler time, closer to the rhythms of the earth. But simplicity does not mean ease. And the truth of a teen mother's life in ancient Mesopotamia was not one of gentle, pastoral peace. It was a life shaped by necessity, by biology, by deeply rooted customs, and by the silent strength of youth, forced to grow up far too soon. And yet, somehow, amid the burdens and boundaries, those young mothers left behind a legacy, not written in stone, but carried in the arms of the next generation, and the next, and the next, until it reached us here, listening in the quiet. If you're still awake, tell me, What part of her life do you think you'd have struggled with the most? Her isolation? Her youth? Or the silence that followed her story? You can let me know in the comments if your eyes haven't yet closed. Now, shall we gently drift forward to the next land? The olive-scented winds of Athens await. Maiden mothers in classical Athens. The city of Athens, brilliant, white, sun-soaked, and steeped in the smoky scent of olive groves, was not always as we imagine it now. Yes, the Parthenon stood proud upon its rocky hill, and the agora buzzed with voices, debates, and laughter. But beyond its marble columns and famous philosophers lived ordinary lives, often silent in history's grand retellings. And among those quieter lives were young girls, some barely past childhood, whose journeys into womanhood were hastened not by choice, but by the will of family, society, and fate. In their soft, dimly lit rooms, these maiden mothers whispered lullabies long before their own voices had deepened into womanhood. Let us now sit quietly with them. In the classical era of Athens, girlhood was brief, if not altogether invisible in the eyes of law and tradition. A girl's childhood might have been filled with simple joys, gathering flowers, playing with dolls carved from rags or clay, imitating dances of older women during festivals to Artemis or Athena. But once she reached her first menstruation, known as menarche, the world shifted beneath her. In the view of the Athenian household, this change in the body signaled readiness for marriage, and with marriage, the expectation of immediate childbearing. The average age for marriage among Athenian girls was approximately 14 to 15 years, though always written, of course, in letters rather than digits here, while their husbands, frequently nearing 30 or beyond, had often completed their military training and entered civic life. The disparity in age, experience, and societal standing was stark, but rarely questioned. Marriage in Athens was not built upon romantic ideals, but upon oikos, the concept of the household. The goal was to produce legitimate heirs, to preserve wealth, to continue the bloodline. The girl's emotions, her readiness, her dreams, these were largely irrelevant to the transaction. And so, a young girl might find herself, almost overnight, transferred from her father's home to that of a husband she had only glimpsed from a balcony or marketplace stall. The transition was marked by ritual. Her hair might be cut short and dedicated to a goddess, her toys and childhood garments given to Artemis as a farewell. What followed was a quiet severing from girlhood, from play, from selfhood as she had known it. In her new home, the responsibilities placed upon her were immense. She was expected to oversee the domestic sphere, managing servants, preparing wool, maintaining stores of oil, olives, grain, and wine. And above all, she was expected to bear children, quickly, and preferably sons. Pregnancy, for a girl whose body was still finding its rhythm, was both sacred and perilous. There were few physicians and fewer still who specialized in female health. Instead, birth and fertility were the domain of midwives and elder women who leaned on centuries of oral knowledge, herbal remedies, and divine supplication. Offerings might be made to Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, or to Hera, patroness of marriage. Laurel leaves might be burned. Incense drifted across the floors, and the girl, often frightened, always watched, would feel life stir within her even as she was still discovering her own. When the time came to give birth, the process was intimate but harrowing. A birthing stool, designed to keep the mother upright, was used by many. The midwives would chant softly, gripping the girl's hands, pressing warm cloths to her brow. There were no painkillers, no epidurals, no sterilized instruments, only breath pressure, and the eternal hope that both mother and child would emerge whole. In the shadows of Athenian homes, many did not. Those who did survive often found themselves in a swirl of obligation. There was no time to recover gently, no period of emotional adjustment. The infant required constant care, and the household demanded order. Wet nurses were rarely used in lower-class homes, so the young mother nursed her child herself, rising at all hours to soothe cries, swaddle limbs, and pace stone floors in the dark. Her own desires, curiosities, and longings were quietly folded away with her childhood linens. Society offered little reflection of her inner life. In Athenian plays and philosophy, women were often written about in abstractions, idealized as pure vessels, or criticized as burdensome temptresses. Their actual voices, fears, joys, and identities were seldom preserved. No scroll survives with the diary of a 15-year-old mother in Athens. No temple frieze shows her tucking her baby into sleep. But she was there, every day, invisible, yet indispensable. She was the hand behind the son who would later speak in the assembly. She was the whisper behind the young soldier's courage. If she bore a daughter, that child, too, would enter the same cycle, a life of quiet repetition, bounded by hearth and birth, joy and loss. And yet, despite the rigidity of her role, this young mother might have found moments of sweetness, a giggle from her child, a shared smile with a neighbor, a festival day when she could wear saffron robes and walk in the procession, remembered for a fleeting moment as something more than a womb. Among wealthier families, the burden was different but no lighter. High-born girls were often kept secluded from public life, reared in the gynaikonitis, the women's quarters of the house, where they were shielded from strangers and seldom seen outside without an escort. Here, a teen mother's isolation could be profound. Her days blurred between spinning wool, managing maids, and keeping her child from fussing too loudly. She might glance out at the courtyard, watch the sun move across the sky, and wonder what lay beyond the gates of her home, what Athens looked like from the marketplace, the docks, the theater. But that world was not hers. Her place was within the oikos, and within that space her identity was bound tightly with her capacity to nurture, to endure, to stay. Still, human spirit finds its cracks through any wall. Perhaps in hushed conversations with visiting cousins, or secret scrolls smuggled in from the symposium, she found small bursts of knowledge, imagination, longing. Perhaps she told stories, tales of gods and monsters, of Helen and Persephone and Penelope, to her child as she rocked them to sleep. And in those stories, she might have heard echoes of her own quiet rebellion, a yearning for more, a remembering of herself. There were, of course, tragedies. Not every teen mother survived childbirth. Not every child survived infancy. Grief in Athens, as everywhere, was stitched into the fabric of life. Clay figurines buried with infants, offerings made in temples for the dead, songs sung for children who never walked. And in these moments, the youth of the mother was made all the more poignant. She, still so close to the innocence of dolls and dancing, now mourning her own child with an ache older than time. But there was also resilience. A young mother in classical Athens might go on to raise multiple children, to manage her household with skill, to earn the respect of her family. She might mentor other girls, pass down herbs and chants, stitch her wisdom into the next generation. Her legacy would live not in marble or ink, but in the hands of those she fed, bathed, comforted. And so, as we sit with her in the stillness, beneath a roof of sun-dried clay, beside a hearth glowing with olive wood embers. We honor her not just as a relic of history, but as a soul who lived, who loved, who endured. Her silence was not empty. It was filled with lullabies, with whispered prayers, with the steady rhythm of life continuing even when unrecorded. Are you still awake? If so, tell me, what do you think she dreamed about in the quiet of her nights? Did she ever imagine another life? Or was her greatest dream simply a healthy child and a moment to herself? Let me know in the comments if your eyelids have not yet surrendered to sleep. Now, take another deep breath. And let's walk onward. Rome awaits, and with it, another chapter of young motherhood, carved not in clay, but in marble. Rome's young matrons and Matronae. When one hears of ancient Rome, the mind often leaps to grandeur. Triumphal arches stretching across sunlit avenues, emperors addressing roaring crowds, philosophers reciting in shaded porticos. The words Imperium Gloria, Virtus, all echo loudly across time. But behind the noise of history's spotlight lived its silence. The soft hush of a girl, no older than 14 or 15, adjusting the folds of her stola for the first time. Her childhood, slipping away beneath the heavy gaze of family expectation. She would become a Matrona, a Roman wife, and likely a mother. Her name would rarely be carved into stone, but her presence would be etched in lineage, in labor, in the quiet resilience that held households together. In Roman society, marriage was both a private affair and a public symbol. Among patricians, a girl's wedding was a transaction, politically significant, socially strategic, and carefully arranged by her father. She had a little say in the matter. By the time she entered her early teens, her family would begin identifying suitable husbands. These men, often well into their 20s or 30s, were not chosen for love, but for legacy. Marriage was not a union of affection. It was an alliance of houses, names, and futures. In the eyes of Roman law, a girl was ready for marriage upon reaching puberty, and thus ready, or rather expected, to begin producing heirs. And so, adorned in a flame-colored veil called the flammeum, with her hair woven into 6 sacred braids, the young bride would walk solemnly from her father's house to her new home. She would carry the symbols of domestic life, spindle, distaff, tokens not of luxury but of labor. Though still a child in spirit, her life as a wife and soon a mother had begun. Inside her new domus, the girl was expected to embody pudicitia, modesty, chastity, obedience, virtues that defined Roman womanhood. Her world was confined to the inner workings of the home, while her husband attended to public matters, law, warfare, debate. She would oversee the kitchen, the slaves, the stores of grain and wine. But above all, she was tasked with reproduction. The continuation of the family name depended on her womb, and so, within weeks or months, the hope and pressure of pregnancy would descend. Imagine her then, a girl of 14, perhaps even younger, waking each day to the dull ache of nausea, her body changing in ways she had no language for. Midwives might whisper reassurances. Elder women might offer herbal tinctures made from rue or pennyroyal. But there was no real medical care, no space for emotional support. If she were of noble birth, she might be swathed in soft linens and tended by handmaidens. If she were of the plebeian class, her swelling belly would not excuse her from chores, from laundry, from kneading bread or hauling water. Her body, young and tender, was still seen as a vessel, not a soul. Roman beliefs about childbirth were an odd mixture of reverence and superstition. Lucina, the goddess of birth, was often invoked during labor. statues of Juno were adorned with garlands. Sacred rituals were conducted to ward off the evil eye, and charms made of coral or silver were hung above the bed. But for all the prayers and protections, childbirth remained brutally dangerous, especially for those whose bodies had scarcely finished growing. During labor, she might have been surrounded by women, midwives, sisters, aunts, singing chants, massaging her limbs, encouraging her through waves of pain. Yet many labors ended in silence. Complications were common, especially among younger mothers. Hemorrhaging, obstructed labor, or puerperal fever could claim the life of the mother, the child, or both. Even in wealthier homes, death came often and quietly. But for those who survived, motherhood began immediately. The infant, if born healthy, was presented to the father. He held the legal power of patria potestas, the right to accept or reject the child. If he lifted the baby, it would be raised. If not, it might be abandoned at a public place known for foundlings, or given to a childless couple, or left to fate. This tradition did not spare the young mother the heartbreak. Though the law may have declared the father's choice final, it was the girl who would carry the memory. If the child was accepted, the girl would nurse the baby, though wealthier households might employ a nutrix, a wet nurse, and tend to it day and night. Swaddled in woolen cloths, the infant would be rocked with whispered rhymes, soothed with herbs, and introduced to the gods through small home rituals. Roman homes had household shrines, or lararia, where prayers were offered to the spirits of ancestors. It's likely that many a young mother knelt there by lamplight, praying for strength, or for her child to sleep just a little longer. Despite the rigidity of Roman society, there were cracks through which the light of affection and tenderness seeped. Letters written on wax tablets, rare but treasured, speak of mothers weeping at their child's illness or rejoicing in their first steps. Grave inscriptions sometimes bear words of surprising softness, etched by husbands for wives who died young in childbirth, calling them dulcissima, most sweet, or luxmea, my light. These traces remind us that love did exist, even in arranged marriages, even in uneven beginnings. Still, the life of a teen mother in Rome was rarely one of choice. Her body belonged to the family line. Her time was consumed by the relentless needs of infants, the demands of servants, the expectations of in-laws. If she lived long enough, she might bear many children, 5, 6, even more, though it was not uncommon for half to die in infancy. Grief became woven into the fabric of motherhood. The same arms that rocked a cradle one year might dig a grave the next. Among the elite, there was the added pressure of honor. A wife's behavior reflected upon her husband's reputation. Any hint of infidelity, even imagined, could bring disgrace. Divorce, while relatively easy for men, was rarely favorable to women. A teenage bride who failed to bear sons might be dismissed and returned to her family in shame. Her youth did not shield her from consequence. In fact, it made her more vulnerable to it. And yet, even in such a structured world, individuality found expression. A teen mother might have found solace in the arts, embroidery, storytelling, the arranging of flowers. She might have taught her children Latin letters, or sung to them the myths of Romulus and Remus, or the tale of Lucretia, whose tragic fate whispered warnings to every Roman daughter. Perhaps she watched her son don his first toga virilis, marking his own step into manhood, and felt a quiet pride bloom inside her. It is tempting to look back and judge, or pity, or romanticize, but perhaps we should instead simply sit with her, this young Matrona, and witness her life as it was, complex, burdened, enduring. She existed not in the dramas of emperors, but in the everyday, a realm of quiet, of rocking chairs and lullabies, of oil lamps burning low into the night. If you're still awake, what do you think her happiest moment might have been? A child's laugh, a letter from a distant sister, a stolen moment in the garden beneath the fig trees. Let me know in the comments if your mind has not yet floated into dreams. Now, we leave the domus, step softly past the atrium and drift southward to where the Nile coils like a ribbon of life, and young mothers once offered prayers to the goddess Isis beneath a golden sun. Daughters of the Nile, Egypt's teenage mothers. The Nile, wide and winding, has always been more than a river. It is a memory that flows, an ancient whisper that cradles the land like a lullaby hummed for millennia. In the hush of its early morning mists, where reeds sway like soft prayers and ibis birds stalk the shore with delicate patience, one might imagine hearing the soft cries of an infant, and beside it, the steady breath of a very young mother. In ancient Egypt, long before the time of Cleopatra or the grand visions of empire, girlhood flowed as swiftly as the floodwaters. One season, she played beside the river, skin warmed by sun and laughter. And by the next, her world would shift. Her body watched for signs of readiness. Her childhood swept away in quiet custom, and her name prepared for pairing. Marriage came early for girls in ancient Egypt. It was not uncommon for unions to be arranged soon after a girl's first signs of fertility, perhaps 12, perhaps 13. Puberty, though only recently arrived, was seen not as a fragile in-between, but as a gateway. Once the blood began, the contracts followed, often made between families of equal social standing. Marriage was at once a social expectation and a practical necessity. A girl brought into marriage at this age was not regarded as too young. Rather, she was simply entering her natural path, one laid long before she could name her own desires. Her new home might be no more than a simple mud-brick house with a flat roof and a small courtyard shaded by palm fronds. In wealthier households, she might sleep on woven linen beneath a painted ceiling adorned with lotus flowers and stars. In humbler homes, a mat on the ground, a shared space, and the scent of herbs burning gently to keep insects away. But no matter the walls, her role was fixed. She was to become a wife and, very soon, a mother. Pregnancy for such young girls was met with a mixture of celebration and silent worry. There were no formal ceremonies for first pregnancies, but older women in the community, mothers, aunts, midwives, often gathered close, offering advice, sharing old remedies, wrapping their knowledge in story and song. The ancient Egyptians were remarkably attentive to the human body. Their papyri recorded spells, herbal concoctions, and practices for nearly every phase of life, and among them, plenty addressed childbirth. She might be offered dates mixed with milk, pomegranate juice to cool her fever, honey to sweeten her breath. To ease her swelling ankles, elder women might massage her feet with oils, perhaps scented with frankincense or myrrh. To protect the child within her, amulets were worn, small carved figures of Tawaret, the hippo-headed goddess of childbirth, were tied to cords and hung around her neck or above the door. Another common guardian was Bes, a squat, lion-faced deity, whose wide eyes and crooked tongue were said to scare away evil spirits that threatened mothers and infants alike. Despite these protections, the dangers loomed. Her pelvis, still narrow, could complicate labor. Her body, still developing, bore the strain of carrying life before it had even settled into its own. And yet, the expectations remained. The child must come, and come well. When the moment of birth arrived, it did not begin with fanfare, but with quiet. The girl would be taken to the birthing room, sometimes a specially set-apart chamber in the house, or even a simple partitioned corner. She would crouch or squat, supported by midwives who knew every turn of breath, every tightening muscle. The birth bricks, two rectangular supports upon which the mother squatted or leaned, were set in place. These bricks, sometimes painted with protective deities, had been part of the birthing ritual for centuries. Torches flickered. Women sang softly. One voice might whisper invocations to Hathor, the goddess of love, fertility, and motherhood. Another might chant words of encouragement, of hope, of survival. And in the middle of it all, a girl barely past her 12th year gripped the hands of her attendants, her brow soaked in sweat, her body straining against pain far older than her years. When the child arrived, wet, red, fragile, the room exhaled. A healthy cry was cause for celebration. A quiet infant brought worry. The cord was cut with flint or bronze, and the newborn wrapped in linen. If the mother had survived, she was laid down, wiped with cloth soaked in lotus water or wine, and given barley porridge to restore her strength. If she had not, the baby would be passed to another, a sister, an aunt, a wet nurse. Life, even in its most sacred moment, made no promises. But let us say she survived. Let us sit beside her now, the child resting on her chest, her eyes half closed in exhaustion. Her arms still tremble, her ribs ache, her voice is hoarse. But she breathes, and so does her baby. And in that shared breath, something ancient stirs, a love that does not yet speak its name, but wraps itself like river mist around her heart. Nursing followed quickly. In wealthier homes, wet nurses were employed, sometimes enslaved women, sometimes trusted neighbors. But in most households, the mother herself nursed her child. The baby fed often and slept in short stretches. There were no cribs, just woven baskets lined with cloth, sometimes shaped like the sarcophagus forms that surrounded the dead, as if to remind the living how narrow the line could be. The young mother learned to swaddle, to bathe, to soothe with coos and hummed melodies. She still missed her own mother, still thought about the days when she had no one to care for but herself. But she grew into her role, slowly and silently, as the Nile floods crept up the banks each year, without rush, without ceremony, simply as life unfolding. Rituals surrounded the child's growth. Names were carefully chosen, sometimes reflecting the gods, sometimes family ancestry, sometimes omens. Protective charms were worn. Small rites were performed to mark the passing of early infancy, and all the while the young mother aged beside her child. By 17, she might have 2 or 3 children. By 20, perhaps 4. By 30, if she lived so long, she would be a grandmother in all but name, her own daughters entering the cycle anew. Life was not always heavy. There was beauty, festivals to attend, perfumes to make, songs to sing at dusk. The rhythms of Egyptian life, from farming to funerals, followed the stars and the flood. And within those rhythms the young mother found meaning, maybe even joy. She might have strolled with her child along the canals, pointing out the lotus flowers, watching the fishermen cast their nets. She might have sat with other women, grinding grain, their stories and laughter rising with the desert wind. She might have looked at her sleeping child and whispered secrets only a mother knows, secrets about fear, about wonder, about the strange, aching fullness that comes from loving something so small, so completely. When illness came, as it often did, she prayed. She anointed her child with oils, burned incense in the doorway, murmured the names of deities like Sekhmet and Isis. But if the fever climbed too high, if the cough did not ease, there was little she could do but hold the child, rock gently, and wait. Loss was a neighbor in every household, and yet, somehow, life continued. Egyptian tombs often depicted the ideal life, banquet scenes, music, beauty. But buried in lesser-known inscriptions and artifacts are hints of the real, everyday lives of women and girls. A child's tunic, lovingly repaired. A doll carved from ivory, worn smooth by countless small hands. A letter from a husband to a wife, hoping she and the baby are safe, written in ochre ink. These are the echoes that remain, not monuments of conquest, but whispers of care, of continuity. And so, our young Egyptian mother, who once ran barefoot beneath the date palms, now sits at dusk in her doorway, a toddler on her lap, the Nile gleaming gold in the distance. Her story was not told in papyri. Her name was not etched on stelae. But she mattered, and she endured. If you're still awake, tell me, what do you imagine her greatest comfort was? The river, the goddess she prayed to, or the child sleeping against her chest, the only sound the beating of two small hearts? Let me know in the comments if the night has not yet closed your eyes. Now, rest with her a little longer, and then, when you're ready, we shall rise gently and step forward into the echoing chambers of a colder age, where stone castles stood, and expectations whispered harshly behind every tapestry. Medieval Europe awaits. Medieval Europe and the quiet weight of expectation. The chill of the stone floor crept through the straw and into her bare feet long before dawn. Outside, the wind moved through the branches like a sigh, brushing past the wooden shutters of a modest cottage, or perhaps a great hall, depending on who she had been born to. But wherever she lived, and however her days began, the truth of her place in the world was much the same. She was young, she was female, and she was being watched for signs, for changes. For the moment, she would no longer be a child in the eyes of the church, the manor, or the village. In medieval Europe, the idea of childhood was a fragile and fleeting thing, barely recognized in any way we might define it now. There was no adolescence, no protected season of innocence. A girl's life was marked not by her dreams, but by the moment her body changed. When her monthly blood came, quietly and without explanation, she was whispered about, measured for marriage, and sometimes, quite soon, given away. She might be as young as 12 or 13 when her family decided she was ready, or rather, when they decided she was needed elsewhere. Marriage was rarely her choice. It was an agreement between fathers, lords, or bishops. If she was born to nobility, she might be betrothed while still an infant, promised to a future husband to secure land or loyalty. If she was a peasant, the arrangement was no less transactional. Her family would seek a union that offered security, a dowry exchanged, hands shaken over bread and salt. The girl herself was more gift than guest. And so, whether dressed in coarse linen or fine wool, she would be led, often still soft-cheeked, with a voice that hadn't lost its higher pitch, into the role of wife. If she was lucky, her new home welcomed her gently. If not, she was expected to adapt, to obey, to serve, and to begin bearing children without delay. In the great manors and stone castles, The burden of childbearing was tied tightly to lineage. A noble girl who failed to produce a son might face scorn, suspicion, or even annulment. Among the lower classes, the urgency was different but just as heavy. Children were both labor and legacy. The future hands to till fields, mend roofs, and care for aging parents. For a young girl whose hands had only recently stopped playing with straw dolls or carving trinkets from bone or wood, the suddenness of motherhood was dizzying. Pregnancy came with both reverence and risk. The Church taught that motherhood was a sacred calling, a divine gift. The Virgin Mary was the model held up in every sermon, the image of perfect maternal submission. Yet, while sermons spoke of holiness, life spoke of pain. Maternal mortality was terrifyingly common, especially among the young. There were no trained doctors for such things, no surgical intervention, no antiseptics, only midwives, prayer, and the unyielding strength of instinct. The young mother might wake one morning with a strange ache, a knowing heaviness. The women around her, older, practiced, knowing the signs, would offer her warmth, perhaps a poultice of herbs, or whisper the words of old charms passed down through generations. Angelica root, sage, rue, tisans brewed from nettle or comfrey. But they all knew these were offerings, not guarantees. The danger lingered in every swelling belly. When the time came to give birth, the girl would often be surrounded by women. Her husband, unless unusually tender or curious, would likely be elsewhere, tending to his animals, his work, or the tavern. It was not a man's world, this chamber of cries and blood and breath. Instead, it belonged to mothers, sisters, neighbors, midwives, those who had walked through it before and survived. Labor might last hours, even days. A young girl, her frame not yet fully developed, could suffer terribly. Her cries might echo down the hallways of a keep, or be muffled behind thatched walls where no one came but the wind. Sometimes the midwife would cut the child free with a sharpened knife if things went poorly. Other times both child and mother would slip into silence, their names added to the whispered list of those lost in travail. But suppose she survived. Suppose the child survived too. There was no celebration like modern baby showers or hospital gifts. There was simply work. The baby had to be fed by the mother herself unless she had a wet nurse, which was rare outside the nobility. The mother's breasts might swell painfully. She might bleed for weeks, exhausted and sleepless. And yet, she was still expected to rise, to tend the fire, to cook or spin or clean. There were no days off for postpartum recovery. Her rest was what she stole in the margins, while the baby nursed, while bread baked, while the snow fell quietly outside the shuttered window. The church would soon require baptism. Infants were baptized quickly, often within days, for fear that they might die unblessed. A priest would pour holy water on the child's head, naming them before God, sealing them in the eyes of heaven. The mother might still be bleeding as she stood to watch. Motherhood offered little time for reflection. The days were dictated by need, the baby's hunger, the fire's demands, the endless hum of chores, mending, brewing, milking, scrubbing, and often there would be another pregnancy within a year. It was not uncommon for a teen mother in medieval Europe to give birth to 5, 6, even 8 children over the course of her life, though many would not live past infancy. Still, there were moments, small moments, like candlelight dancing on the baby's cheek, the sound of a soft gurgle against the hush of twilight, a shared smile with another young mother at the village well. These flickers of tenderness did not erase the weight, but they softened it. What did she think about as she lay beside her baby at night? Did she wonder what life might have been if she had not been married so young? Did she dream of stories she had once been told, of saints and sinners and dragons and distant queens? Did she remember what it felt like to run through fields without a belly heavy with life? Did she whisper to her child the hopes she had never been allowed to speak aloud? Her life was not entirely without joy. Festivals wrought brief escapes, days of music and dancing and shared food. Sometimes there were village plays, or processions where saints' relics were paraded and candles lit in solemn prayer. A young mother might dress her child in freshly washed linen and walk to church, the bells ringing above like old promises. She might light a candle not just for salvation but for protection, for strength, for time. And when grief came, as it so often did, it came quietly, like frost. A baby, feverish, with no remedy. A child who stopped breathing in the night. A tiny grave dug behind the chapel, marked with nothing but a stone and a tear. The mother's mourning was not public. She wept into her sleeve, wiped her eyes, and continued, because she had no choice. But still, she lived. She persisted. She fed the next child. She taught them prayers and songs, and how to kneel and how to stir porridge just right. She raised them to walk the same narrow path she had once walked herself. Her story, like so many, was never written down. The monks recorded the lives of kings, bishops, and warlords, not young mothers with cracked hands and steady hearts. But their presence lingers in the worn steps of chapel floors, in the grooves of wooden spoons, in the warmth passed from one body to another on cold winter nights. If you're still awake, tell me, where do you think she found her strength? In God? In her baby's breath? In the silence between duties? Let me know, gently, in comments, if your mind has not yet surrendered to sleep. Now, curl a little deeper beneath your blanket. We are leaving the cold stone walls of Europe and crossing oceans to walk beneath cherry blossoms and listen to the rustle of silk and whispers in the world of feudal Japan. Beneath the cherry blossoms of feudal Japan. The wind in Japan is softest in spring. It travels quietly through the mountain passes and over the thatched rooftops of distant villages, whispering through bamboo forests and playing lightly with the petals of the sakura. In that particular hush, the pause before a petal lets go of its stem, you can almost hear it. The rustle of a kimono, the breath of a girl not yet grown, holding her belly with both hands, waiting to become a mother. In feudal Japan, the boundaries between childhood and adulthood were as delicate and impermanent as the cherry blossoms themselves. A girl's life was defined not so much by her dreams as by the structure of her household, her clan, her caste, and the needs of her time. Whether she lived in the high-walled residence of a daimyo's estate or in the small wooden home of a farmer's family, her path was shaped not by choice but by custom, quiet, unchallenged, and often unseen. Girls were trained early in the ways of propriety, obedience, and stillness. In samurai households, the daughter of a nobleman might study calligraphy, floral arrangement, poetry, and the rituals of the tea ceremony. She would be taught to bow, to listen without interrupting, to fold her hands properly in her lap. And by the age of 12 or 13, she would be observed more closely, not for signs of personality or genius, but for the maturing curves of her figure, the elegance of her gait, the clarity of her skin. when the time was right, discussions would begin. A marriage arrangement was not always something she was privy to. It might be decided by her father and a family elder, or, in the case of samurai families, as part of a political strategy to bind two houses in mutual support. Among the peasantry and artisan classes, marriage could be more personal, yet still driven by economy and survival. A girl might be married off to help her family reduce mouths to feed, or she might become the bride of a boy just slightly older than herself, both of them already laboring since the age of 6 or 7. There was no wedding march, no lace veil, no carved rings. There was only the quiet movement of one life into another, the girl's belongings tied in a bundle of cloth, her mother brushing her hair one last time before she crossed the threshold of someone else's home. In more formal households, especially among the ruling class, this transition was veiled in ceremony. She might dress in layers of silk, her face powdered pale, her lips colored faintly red. She would bow deeply to her elders and kneel before ancestral altars. But beneath all the etiquette and incense, a simple truth remained. She was still a child in age, asked to become something far older in spirit. Pregnancy was expected to follow swiftly. In some households, failure to conceive within a year was grounds for concern. Herbs and diets would be adjusted, prayers offered at temples, and the girl, barely into her teens, would bear the invisible weight of expectation. A woman's worth, especially among the higher castes, was measured in children, more specifically, in sons. For girls of samurai class, the ideal mother was the Onna Bugeisha, the warrior wife, strong yet gentle, obedient yet brave, capable of bearing sons who would become soldiers of honor. She was expected to manage the household with efficiency, raise her children in virtue, and endure all hardships with composure. And all of this, often, while she herself was still no more than 14. In the smaller villages away from the pomp of court life, the experience was less ceremonial but no less profound. A young peasant girl, married before her voice had even deepened from childhood, would rise before the sun to sweep, cook rice, and tend to the animals. Her first pregnancy might be discovered not with joy, but with anxiety, for even though children were blessings, the act of bearing them was dangerous, and for a girl whose body had scarcely matured, doubly so. Midwifery in Japan was a tradition of women. Sankei, the birth attendants, were often older women of experience, respected for their steady hands and knowledge of herbal remedies. They knew the signs of a turning baby, the bitter teas to reduce swelling, the warm cloths to soothe muscle cramps, and when labor came, in a darkened room, on a woven mat, with maybe a single candle flickering beside a shrine, they were the ones who helped a child bring forth a child. The young mother might bite her lip to stay silent during the worst of it, taught to endure pain without screaming. A quiet birth was considered noble, even virtuous. Yet, inside fear raced through her like a wild river. Would she survive? Would her child? Would she still be valued if the baby did not cry? And then, the moment, a slick, warm bundle pressed to her chest, still wet and quivering with life. Or perhaps, heartbreakingly, not. Both outcomes were familiar, and neither was spoken of for long. In households that valued stoicism and duty, grief was swallowed like bitter tea, quickly and without display. If the child lived, the next days were filled with ritual. The Miyameri, a shrine visit for the newborn, would be performed around the 30th day. The baby would be carried by a relative, often the maternal grandmother, dressed in ceremonial cloth, and presented to the guardian spirits for protection. The mother, still sore and weary, might watch from the shadows or walk quietly behind. Her own purification, required by custom, came later, symbolizing her re-entry into the spiritual cleanliness of society. The life that followed was one of near constant tending, feeding, cleaning, watching, waiting. The baby needed her at all hours, yet so did the rest of the house. If she was of lower caste, she had no servants. If she was of noble birth, she was still expected to supervise maids, manage supplies, and host guests. Her day belonged to others, as did her night. Her identity, whatever it had been, now blurred beneath the titles of wife and mother. And yet, beneath it all, she was still herself. Perhaps she whispered poetry to her infant, short verses learned in her own girlhood. Perhaps she found comfort in arranging flowers, their gentle stems reminding her that beauty still existed in a world that often asked too much. Perhaps she laughed with her child just once, when no one else was watching, the kind of laugh that made her eyes fill with tears before she even knew why. She might have had more children, sometimes one after another. By her early 20s, she could have 5, but she might also have none. Infertility was a shadow that followed many, and for those who could not bear children, or whose children did not survive, life was harder still. Some were quietly replaced or returned to their families. Others remained in their husbands' homes, serving as caretakers to nieces and nephews, or turning inward toward prayer and solitude. In rare cases, a young woman might choose to leave it all behind, to become a nun, shaving her head, donning robes, and entering the hushed simplicity of a Buddhist temple. There, among the slow rituals and scented incense, she could reclaim a sense of self. But even that path came with sacrifice. She would never see her children again. And so the majority stayed and endured, and loved in their own way. Some mothers taught their children to write haiku. Others trained their daughters in music or etiquette. Some watched their sons ride off to war with tears that never fell from their eyes. Their love was expressed in packed rice balls, in folded robes, in stories whispered through paper screens. These mothers, girls who had barely left behind the games of their own youth, shaped Japan's generations not through decree or conquest, but through stillness, resilience, and the gentle holding of tiny hands. If you're still awake, what part of her life speaks to you most? Her silence, her endurance, or the joy she may have found in a fleeting smile? Let me know softly in the comments if your mind is still drifting beside the petals. Now, let the wind carry us again, across the wide oceans, to the first peoples of vast forests and plains, where the wisdom of nature guided even the youngest mothers. Let us now listen to the heartbeat of the earth, and of those who lived closest to it. Indigenous traditions across the Americas, before the maps were drawn, before the names we now use were spoken, before ships arrived from distant lands with sails that cut the sky like white spears, there were people here, people who had already built worlds with memory, spirit, and song. The land itself held their stories. Mountains remembered their footsteps. Rivers hummed lullabies their mothers once sang. And in this sacred expanse, from the icy ridges of the far north to the soft breezes of the southern jungles, girls grew into women, and women, sometimes while still girls, became mothers. Across the vast territories we now call the Americas, thousands of unique cultures flourished long before colonization, each with its own language, cosmology, and relationship with the earth. And among them, the journey from girlhood to motherhood was shaped not by clocks or digits, but by signs from the body, omens from the stars, and guidance from elders who watched with quiet wisdom. For many indigenous nations, the concept of age was fluid. A girl was not defined by the number of winters she had seen, but by what she knew, how she carried herself, and when the sacred signals of change came. These signals were most often marked by menarche, the first bleeding. In numerous tribes, this moment was not shrouded in shame or secrecy, but honored with rituals. In some traditions, girls were secluded in special lodges, tended to by elder women, taught sacred knowledge about their role in the cycle of life. They fasted, painted their faces with ochre or charcoal, wove stories into their hair. They were not told, "You are a woman now," in harshness. They were welcomed into womanhood like a dawn, being greeted by the mountain peaks. Marriage arrangements varied widely. Among some nations, marriages were formed through mutual affection, with the consent of the girl and her family. In others, alliances were made between clans to strengthen ties. Among the Navajo, the matrilineal system gave women strong authority, and a girl's kin often ensured her well-being was protected. In Haudenosaunee culture, women held power as clan mothers, and marriages were often balanced by responsibility, not simply possession. Yet, in other societies, particularly as external pressures from settlers increased, young girls could be taken or traded, their youth becoming collateral in times of hardship or warfare. And so, for some, the passage into motherhood came gently, rooted in affection, rhythm, and ceremony. For others, it arrived abruptly, with fear and pain, especially during times of displacement, famine, or colonizing violence. The experience was never singular. It changed with the wind, with the season, with the path of the buffalo, or the growth of corn. But it always carried weight, the sacred weight of life being passed from one body into another. Pregnancy, when carried within the warm embrace of tradition, was seen as a sacred act. The womb was not simply a vessel, but a portal, where spirit entered flesh. Among the Lakota, a pregnant woman might receive special songs to sing to the child before it was born. Among the Maya, women observed food and behavior taboos to ensure balance. In the Inuit North, elder women passed down knowledge of how to position the baby, how to breathe with the ice and the wind, how to listen for the child's arrival in silence. A young girl, perhaps 13, perhaps younger, might not have understood it all, but she would be surrounded by others who did. A circle of women, midwives, aunties, and grandmothers would gather, weaving their experience around her like a blanket. She would not birth alone. The lodge would be dark, warm, filled with cedar smoke or the scent of sage. Hands would hold hers. Prayers would be murmured in old tongues. If she cried, no one scolded her. If she screamed, the wind carried it, and no one flinched. If she fell asleep in exhaustion after the child was born, someone would cover her, hum softly, and watch the newborn with quiet eyes. Not every birth ended in joy. Some ended in blood and silence. In grief, mothers sang low songs that only the earth understood. In certain tribes, tiny cradles were buried beneath sacred trees, or ashes spread in rivers, with chants to guide the spirit back to the stars. Even the smallest life was honored. But let us imagine a birth that ends in life. A young girl, her arms still soft with childhood, now holds a child against her breast. She nurses by moonlight. She wraps the baby in rabbit skin, or bark cloth, or finely woven alpaca wool, if she lives in the high Andean valleys. She watches the baby's mouth move and feels something crack open in her chest. Something that is not fear, not yet pride, but something vast and wordless and deeply ancient. Motherhood did not isolate her. In many indigenous communities, the care of children was shared. Sisters helped. Cousins brought water. Elders advised. Babies were passed from arm to arm, never too far from warmth or watchfulness. A young mother might still work in the fields, grind corn, gather berries, fish in shallow streams. But her baby would be on her back, wrapped tightly, heart against heart, breath against breath. The lullabies she sang were not written down. They drifted on wind and memory, syllables changing with each telling. Some were prayers, some were dreams, some were stories of animals and ancestors. She might tell her baby how the bear brought fire, or how the coyote laughed the stars into place. She might whisper the name of the grandmother who dreamed of the baby before it was born. There were hardships, winters that bit deep, crops that failed, colonizers who took and burned and renamed everything, diseases that came on foreign breath, wars that no mother wanted. And in those times, even the youngest mothers had to become stone and wind and fire all at once. They held babies as their homes were burned. They hid their daughters from soldiers. They sang in languages forbidden. They braided their children's hair in patterns that spelled resistance. Yet, despite the losses, traditions endured, even in forced boarding schools, where children were stolen from their mothers in hopes of erasing their culture. The memory of lullabies lingered. The feeling of being wrapped in hide or held against a mother's chest could not be erased. And those young mothers, barely past girlhood, carved their love into every fiber of survival. They taught their children to remember, to return, to reclaim. In some nations, young mothers grew into elders who passed on birth songs. In others, they were remembered through beaded belts or woven baskets, their names whispered at solstice ceremonies. In every land, they shaped the people who would rise again, with language, land, and love stitched back together. So now, sit with her. She may be wearing buckskin, or painted in red ochre, or draped in feathers. She may be chewing dried berries, rocking her baby by firelight. Her eyes are tired, but her hands are steady. The baby sleeps, heart pressed against her ribs, safe in the rhythm of her breath. No one writes her name. But she is history, she is strength, she is still here. If you're still awake, tell me, what part of her life would you carry with you? Her closeness to nature, her community of women, her courage in the face of so much silence. Let me know, softly, in the comments, if your eyes haven't yet closed like petals at dusk. Now, we will leave the forests and plateaus behind. We will step forward in time, into lamp-lit halls and the whir of industrial gears, and into the tightly laced corsets of a world about to modernize. The Victorian-Era awaits. The scars and strength of Victorian-Era youth. The Victorian-Era, a name that evokes images of gaslight flickering in the fog, of horse-drawn carriages clattering along cobbled streets, of lace gloves and glinting brooches, of parlors scented faintly with lavender and quiet propriety. But beneath this illusion of elegance and decorum lived a truth far less embroidered. It is there, in that hush of expectation, that we find the forgotten girls, the young ones, just on the edge of womanhood, who were asked to carry the weight of motherhood while still memorizing their table manners. Victorian society, stretching from the early 1840s, into the final years of the century was obsessed with appearances. Modesty, discipline, and moral restraint were held up like stained glass virtues. Every class, from the chimney-swept poor to the chandelier-drenched elite, participated in the performance of propriety. But within those performances, the natural, messy, aching truths of girlhood were concealed behind veils, corsets, and silence. A girl of 12 or 13 might still play with dolls, yet her world was already narrowing. Her body, once a source of freedom and childhood, was now being watched for posture, for modesty, for signs of ripeness. Menstruation, when it arrived, was not discussed openly. It was whispered about in euphemisms: the curse, a visitor, woman's time. She would be handed cloth, given minimal explanation, and told, not asked, to carry herself differently now. If her family was of means, her path might be carefully charted. Education was limited, more decorative than practical. She would learn to draw, to play the piano, to speak French just enough to charm a guest. But the true lesson, the unspoken one, was always this: marry well, bear children, keep a home, be silent when pain arises, endure. Marriage for girls came young, especially in rural communities, or when financial pressure loomed. 14, 15, sometimes even younger. A girl might be wed to a man twice her age, chosen not for kindness, but for property, position, or connections. Her consent, if offered, was often symbolic. It was assumed that her duty was clear. On the wedding day, her hair would be carefully styled, her body laced into a gown that restricted breath and movement, her face powdered pale. But inside the corset, a child remained, nervous, uncertain, unready. She would be handed off from father to husband, like a carefully kept secret. In wealthier homes, the marriage might be paraded, photographed, praised in social columns. In poorer homes, it might be hurried and plain, followed immediately by work and responsibility. But in all cases, the same reality soon followed. Expectation, the expectation of pregnancy, of childbearing, of becoming, fully and without question, a wife and mother. Pregnancy, when it came, was shrouded in mystery. Victorian England was not kind to the female body. Open discussion of biology was considered indecent. A young mother might know very little about what was happening inside her, only that her dresses no longer fit, and that she was expected to smile through the discomfort. Medical understanding of pregnancy was limited. Doctors were often men, and women, especially young ones, were discouraged from expressing pain too clearly. Hysteria was a term often used to dismiss a woman's suffering. Herbal remedies abounded, some effective, many dangerous. Pennyroyal, tansy, and ergot were used, sometimes to try to prevent pregnancy, other times to ease its symptoms. These treatments were not without risk. The line between remedy and poison was thin. If the girl was wealthy, she might be confined during her later months, kept in her room, away from society, lest her growing belly offend the delicate sensibilities of guests. If she was poor, she would work until the day her waters broke. Factory girls labored beside the machines, pregnant bellies hidden beneath soot-darkened aprons, hoping they would not be dismissed. Servants concealed their swelling midsections with shame. On farms, young wives bent over fields, their unborn children tugging at every movement. When labor came, it was often met with fear. Pain relief was limited. Chloroform was controversial and not widely available outside of cities. In many cases, girls were told that suffering was their lot, a test of character, a divine correction for Eve's ancient mistake. Religious texts were quoted more often than medical ones. The delivery might be attended by a midwife, if one could be afforded. In wealthier homes, a male doctor might arrive, though not always with gentle hands. In poorer neighborhoods, a neighbor, an aunt, or sometimes no one at all, would serve as birth assistant. The process could last hours, even days, and for young girls whose bodies were not yet fully formed, the danger of obstructed labor was real and frequent. Deaths in childbirth were common. So too were stillbirths, fevers, infections, hemorrhage. The risks were many, the resources few. A girl might go into labor in the early morning and be buried by sunset. But suppose she survived. Suppose the child did too. Then came the second test, motherhood. There was no time to recover. There was no counseling, no nurturing of the nurturer. The infant needed to be fed. If the girl could nurse, she did. If not, animal milk or a wet nurse would be used, depending on class and availability. Diapers had to be changed, often little more than cloth strips washed by hand. Night after night, she rose to tend the baby, sometimes in a candlelit nursery lined with silk, sometimes on a straw mattress shared with siblings. Her body, still sore, still leaking, still raw, had no rest. Her emotions, fear, grief, confusion, had no language. Postpartum depression, if it came, had no name. She was expected to smile, to host visitors, to dress her child in bonnets and booties, to stand still for photographs, a lace-curtained frame for a baby she barely knew how to hold. There was no space for her to speak the truth, that she was still, in many ways, a child herself. And yet, amid the pain, love found its way in. A baby's grasping fingers, the soft smell of milk and linen, the first smile, the first coo, moments that made her breath catch, even as her body trembled with fatigue. Motherhood became her identity. She was no longer a girl. She was no longer simply a wife. She was Mama. Her name, her wishes, her past, all folded into that single role. Sometimes she would catch her reflection in the parlor glass, eyes ringed with tiredness, hair undone, a line between her brows that hadn't been there before. She would stare, not in vanity, but in wonder. Who is this? When did I become her? And the baby, now sleeping against her shoulder, would stir, and the answer would arrive, not in words, but in warmth. Life went on. For some, that life was gentle. A kind husband, a supportive family, enough money to soften the edges. But for many, life was hard. A husband who drank, a mother-in-law who criticized, poverty, cold winters, another pregnancy before the first baby could walk. And still, they endured. These girls turned mothers were the hidden engines of Victorian life. Their hands made the meals. Their arms held the future. Their silence held the weight of generations. They were not celebrated in novels. They were not painted by artists. But their legacy is real, tucked into the pages of family Bibles, whispered about in attic journals, glimpsed in fading daguerreotypes. If you're still awake, tell me, do you think she ever got a moment to herself? A single hour to walk outside, breathe deeply, and remember who she was? Let me know gently in the comments, if the gaslight hasn't yet faded from your mind. Now, exhale softly. We're stepping forward again, into a time of rations, uniforms, telegrams, and the brave, quiet strength of girls who raised children with one hand and held grief in the other. Wartime mothers in the 20th century. The 20th century arrived not with a lull, but with a rattle. A century not of slow turns and whispered customs, but of sudden shocks, rising smoke, and the frantic ticking of clocks. In a world that once moved by horse and candle, now there were telephones, factory whistles, and locomotives that howled through the night like iron wolves. But despite the roaring engines of progress, some things remained unchanged. Among them, the soft, enduring presence of young girls who, long before they had time to grow into themselves, were asked to carry life. The wars, there were two that bled across the globe like wounds too wide to heal. The first, which began in the early years of the century, consumed sons and fathers. The second followed scarcely a generation later, swallowing even more, lovers, neighbors, brothers, even children. But behind the lines, in homes quieted by absence, young women, some still girls, found themselves carrying burdens as heavy as any soldier's pack, the weight of motherhood, in a world unraveling. In the early decades of the century, especially across Europe and North America, a girl might find herself married by 16, sometimes younger. The expectations of womanhood had shifted little, though corsets had loosened and suffrage was stirring in the air. Even as cities grew and radios hummed with jazz and news bulletins, the old truth held: a girl who could bear children was expected to. Some girls married for love, hastily, breathlessly, before a young man was sent to the trenches of France or the deserts of North Africa. Others married by arrangement or necessity, and some did not marry at all, but still found themselves with child, the evidence of a night's warmth revealed by months of swelling silence. For these girls, the path was harder still. Single motherhood was a stigma. The term illegitimate carried weight like iron chains. In certain towns, a pregnant girl could be sent away to a cousin's home, to a church-run facility, or to a place where her labor would pay for her shame. Some were told to give the baby up. Others had no choice. But many became mothers just the same, quietly, bravely, with trembling hands and hearts already calloused by grief. Imagine her, a girl of 15, maybe 16. She writes a letter each day to the boy she loves who now sleeps in a trench carved from Belgian mud. She wears his photograph in a locket. She reads the newspaper with careful breath, scanning names, scanning places. And all the while her belly grows beneath her blouse, and she wonders if he will ever return to see the curve of their child's cheek. In her small kitchen, she boils water for tea, measures flour with care if she has any left. Wartime meant rations. Sugar was precious. Butter was saved for Sunday. Milk came in powdered tins. Diapers were made from cut-up towels. Cribs were borrowed, stitched together from crates and quilts. There were no baby monitors, no prenatal vitamins, no hospital classes. Just her, and the soft creak of the floorboards as she walked the baby to sleep. If she was lucky, a midwife helped with the birth. If not, it might have been her mother, or a neighbor, or no one but herself, and the cold tiles of a back room. The pain came just the same, and so did the life that followed it. The baby cried. She cried too. And then the days began. Long, strange days, where the radio whispered of battles and bombs. And outside, people walked quickly with their heads down. If the bombs were falling nearby, in London, in Warsaw, in Cologne, she would scoop the baby into her arms and hurry to the shelter. The ground would rumble. Dust would fall from the ceiling. She would press her lips to the baby's head and sing, as softly as she could. A hymn, maybe, or a lullaby her own mother once hummed. Anything to keep the silence away. For those in the countryside, there was more space, but not always more comfort. A young mother might milk cows at dawn, wrap her baby in shawls, and carry them in a sling as she worked. The child would sleep against her heartbeat while she stacked firewood, fed pigs, hung laundry. If her husband was gone to war, gone to a factory, gone without a word, she did it all herself. And in the towns, among the smoke and clatter of industry, girls worked long hours, sorting ammunition, sewing uniforms, tending the wounded, with babies waiting for them at home, or in overcrowded nurseries, or sometimes nowhere at all. The balance between duty and motherhood was never easy. It pulled at her, split her in two, and yet, somehow, she kept walking forward. For many, there was no time to process what had happened, how quickly childhood had ended, how silently the world had asked her to become more than she was ready to be. She did not weep in public. She did not speak of regret. She only kept moving, bottle after bottle, hour after hour, season after season. But there were moments, rare, small, golden moments, when she paused. A baby's first laugh, a letter from the front that began with "My dearest," the way her child's fingers curled around hers, the sun falling across a crib just right, the softness of breath in the crook of her neck. These moments mattered. They were real. They were the thread she clung to. And when peace came, when the war was declared over and the boys came home, some walking, some in caskets, some never at all, the world did not ask what she had endured. It handed her a broom, a ration card, a new set of rules. It said, "Start again." It said, "Be grateful." It said, "Don't speak of what happened." But her silence was full. It held the weight of midnight feedings, of whispered prayers, of grief too sharp to name. It held the smell of powdered milk, the sting of cold bathwater, the hollow ache of rocking an empty crib. It held the laughter, too, the stories she made up, the songs she composed out of thin air, the courage she stitched into every moment. And her child. That child grew into a man or woman who remembered none of the war, none of the rationing, none of the sleepless nights. But they remembered her hands, her voice, her love. That child would go on to live in a world she had helped to rebuild, brick by brick, bottle by bottle, kiss by kiss. Her name is not in the history books. Her photograph, if it exists, is folded in a drawer, black and white, faded at the edges. But she mattered. She was strong, not because she wanted to be, but because she had to be. And she was young, so very young. If you're still awake, tell me, what part of her story lingers in you? The waiting, the working, or the whisper that says, "I'll be brave for us both"? Leave a thought below, if your eyes have not yet surrendered to the quiet. Now, sleep a little deeper. In the next chapter, we'll look at the echoes, how the world changed, and how the image of the teen mother transformed with it. From hush to headline, from shame to survival. Echoes of stigma, survival, and strength through time. There is a certain silence that follows a storm, not empty but full, not peaceful but reverent, as though the world, having endured so much, pauses just long enough to gather itself. The wars had ended. The cities were rebuilding. And in the softened decades that followed, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and onward, the shape of the world began to shift. Roads expanded. Televisions flickered into living rooms. Dresses grew shorter, music louder, and yet, in bedrooms and kitchens, in apartments and farms, young girls were still becoming mothers. But the world had changed. So had the story. In the post-war decades, particularly across the Western world, a new era emerged, an age of suburbia, optimism, and social order. Families were idealized, a mother, a father, children in neat rows, all framed by white picket fences and newspaper smiles. And in this carefully curated image there was no room for deviation, no space for imperfection, and certainly no space for a girl of 15 with a round belly and no ring on her finger. Teen pregnancy, once a reality quietly woven into every era, now became a target of judgment. It was no longer just a personal matter. It became a symbol of failure, a problem to be solved, a statistic. In some communities, teen mothers were sent away, as they had been for centuries. But now, they were sent to maternity homes, quiet places where the curtains were always drawn, and the girls were given new names, new routines, and eventually, new roles. They were taught to sew, to pray, to fold diapers, and most of all, to surrender their babies. Adoption was encouraged, often insisted upon. The belief was that a teenage girl should not raise a child, that her life would be ruined, that her baby would be better off elsewhere. And so, thousands of young mothers gave birth in silence, held their babies once, or not at all, and then went home empty-handed, expected to forget. But forgetting is not what the heart does. Elsewhere, others fought to keep their children, and with that fight came judgment, whispers, raised eyebrows. The phrase, unwed mother, still clung to every syllable like frost. Girls were called reckless, irresponsible, shameful. No matter their love, no matter their effort, their worth was always measured against an impossible standard. And yet, they survived. They worked, sometimes 2 jobs, sometimes 3. They went back to school with tired eyes and quiet grit. They tucked babies into borrowed bassinets in cramped apartments, humming lullabies between homework pages. They wore hand-me-downs, scraped together change for milk, walked through snow with their children wrapped in scarves. And still they laughed. Still they loved. Still they made something out of nothing. In the 70s and 80s, conversations began to shift, slowly, cautiously. Feminist movements brought new language, new understanding. The idea of reproductive choice took root. Conversations about birth control, sexual education, and bodily autonomy reached classrooms and living rooms. But even as knowledge expanded, the stigma remained. Television shows portrayed teen mothers as cautionary tales or caricatures, either too naive or too bold, rarely as full, complex beings. Politicians used teen pregnancy as a symbol of societal decay, a problem to be eradicated. Campaigns were launched. Posters were plastered with slogans and photos designed to shock. But the girls kept living. They made homes in trailers, in dorm rooms, in shelters. They raised babies while still growing themselves. They navigated health systems, welfare offices, public scrutiny. They braided their daughters' hair with fingers that had barely outgrown their own dolls. They walked their sons to school before heading to their own night classes. They did it not because it was easy, not because they were ready, but because they chose to. Some had partners who stayed. Some had families who helped. Others were truly alone, and still they carried on. By the 90s and early 2000s, the cultural narrative began to expand. Stories of resilience were shared. Memoirs were published. Some teen mothers became advocates, teachers, nurses, authors. They spoke not only of hardship, but of the beauty they had found, the fierce bond between mother and child, the joy of watching that child grow, laugh, become. Still, the challenges were immense, poverty, access to childcare, mental health support, judgment. In many places, they persist even now. And yet, despite all the noise, the scolding headlines, the policy debates, the societal hand-wringing, one truth remains. Each young mother is a world of her own. Some fall in love with motherhood instantly. Others struggle to connect. Some thrive. Others survive. And some carry regret woven with love, stitched with sorrow. None of it is simple. None of it is clean. But all of it matters. Behind every statistic is a heartbeat. Behind every judgment is a girl who needed care, not scorn. Behind every headline is a baby who was held, rocked, fed, maybe in a hospital, maybe in a shelter, maybe on a mattress on the floor, but always with a mother who, no matter her age, gave what she could. Today, teen mothers are still here, still facing the same questions: how to finish school, how to feed their child, how to sleep when everything feels uncertain. But now, more than ever, they are finding space, finding support, telling their stories. Online communities offer connection. Some schools offer childcare. Health services are improving, not everywhere, not perfectly, but it is changing. And in bedrooms, in apartments, in places you may never see, a 15-year-old girl rocks her baby to sleep. She whispers promises. She hums a lullaby. She dreams not just for herself anymore, but for both of them. She is strong, not because she planned it, not because she was ready, but because love, when it arrives, asks everything of us, and she chose to say yes. If you're still awake, what would you say to her? If she were sitting beside you right now, would you scold her, or would you say, "I see you. I'm proud of you. You're doing more than you know"? Tell me in the comments if your heart is still gently open. Now, the journey draws to its close, conclusion, and so we have drifted together softly through the ages, from the sun-baked bricks of Mesopotamia to the marble columns of Rome, from the whispering willows of Japan to the frost-laced shutters of Victorian towns, from the war-torn cities and far-reaching plains, all the way to the quiet rooms of our own modern world. We have listened, not to emperors or kings, not to soldiers or scholars, but to the ones history too often leaves in shadow, the girls, barely grown, who became mothers. Their lives were not perfect, their paths were not easy, but their strength, their quiet, enduring strength, is worthy of remembering. If you are still with me, if you have not yet drifted into sleep, I hope this journey has wrapped around you like a warm blanket. I hope the stories rested gently on your thoughts, like falling leaves, like fading embers. And if you are asleep, then may your dreams be soft. Thank you, truly, for spending this night with the Sleepy Scrolls. If you found comfort in this story, if it kept you company, consider subscribing or leaving a gentle thought in the comments below. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, even in silence, your story matters. Good night.